Arame, thank you so much for joining us. Just wanted to begin by asking you about your expectations for the conference here in Hanoi.
It's very nice to be at this conference. It's my first CBA. So actually I came with no expectations, but I need to say that whatever expectations I had was surpassed by the field trip. That was a very valuable experience to see how climate change pans out in the context of Vietnam. And we went and visited floating islands, which is a completely different reality for someone like me, working most of the time in the African setting. So that was a very valuable experience, and I think a good reminder of what CBA really means, and that the community level is the crucial battlefield of adaptation. That was very good.
Can you just elaborate on what you saw at the field trip?
We saw a floating village called Qua Van that's located in the Halong Bay, and it is actually a village that's highly vulnerable to extreme events. They told us how last year there was a big storm, and when that storm hit, their traditional coping mechanisms, which consisted of going to a cave, basically whenever there was a storm or a bad event, that just was made bunk, and that was not useful anymore because of the sheer strength of the event that struck them.
And in terms of the work you're doing in Africa, what kinds of impacts are you seeing local communities coping with?
Now that was a similarity. You do see that although it's a floating village here and there, it's a desert, semi-arid context of a village there, it's similar challenges. It's a new threat, a storm, a flood, an event that the community is not used to. The question is, how do we cope as a society, and mostly how does the community cope to this novel threat?
And to what extent are communities adapting already, and how are they using the information they have?
Question. To a great extent. I think that's the valuable lesson too. We are not saving these communities. They already are doing a lot. In the village we saw, they already have a cave that they go and hide in when there's a storm. In many of the villages I work with in the African context, mostly in the Sahel, dry arid lands, what we see there is they're already doing a lot of coping mechanisms, be it solidarity groups, building temporary shelter, sending the kids to the grandparents. They already have coping mechanisms that they're resorting to. Now, are they sturdy enough to face the larger threats that climate change is likely to bring? That's another question. And I think that's where perhaps our intervention could be valuable.
And to what extent are the global policymakers aware of these local coping mechanisms? What's the communication like between local, national, international groups?
Very little. And I think perhaps that's where we should really strengthen our work. And that's why attendance at this conference is also quite meaningful, because all of us seem to be realizing the shortcomings of the system as it currently is. Now, local is extremely distinct and separated from the national level, so let alone regional and global. But just that gap between the local geographical scale and the national one is one that's of concern. Because if policymakers that are getting the money from the GEF, that are designing all the national projects for adaptation, aren't identifying priority community needs and aren't addressing them, then we're in a problem. And that gap needs to be bridged in the years ahead. That's a priority.
And I was struck by your comment this morning during the presentation that local communities need alerts, not probabilities. What did you mean by that?
So that was in the context of a project that tried to get climate services, weather advisories, for instance, short-term ones, to affected communities that suffer from drought, from floods, that are completely predictable, and that climate forecasters see on their screens. But that information never reaches them. So we started a project that would communicate in a two-way process, not transmitting, but communicate the information down to them. And what we found is that they didn't need all that complicated information. It was jargon, and jargon is not actionable. What they needed was very clear operational alerts that they could use to engage in behavioral change that would save lives and preserve livelihoods.
And just finally then, what's your vision for the future of community-based adaptation? Where would you like us to be in 5-10 years' time?
That's a big one. I do believe that the way forward is more of this type of activities which I described, making sure that the huge gap that's sustained between the geographic levels is bridged, that national level policymakers understand the priority needs of communities, number one. Number two, that the institutional frameworks needed to get information effectively from the centers of knowledge and the hubs of information production are actually relayed to the communities that could use that information to save their lives and actually have their lot better in the face of an increasingly uncertain climate.
Arame, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.